Alright, this is my first video vlog, is that the word they use there? And kind of sloppy right now. My background is just kind of, you can't see much of, it's nothing spectacular. And I'm not really editing this thing, so it's not real smooth. You know, a lot of videos are very nice cut, and they keep it real, the information's real, to the point, you know, timing's really good and everything like that. This is my first video, and we'll just see. I'm gonna do it, wing it more without all that stuff right now, so maybe over time, when I get more time, I can edit it and things like that. And I figure I'm just gonna wing some of this discussion real quick. I don't expect this first video to get a lot of hits, but you know, I'll throw it out there. I figure maybe I'll start with so yeah, I think a lot about philosophy, and I think about things, I think in a way that a lot of people don't. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of people now on YouTube who are very sharp, so I find that many of them are plenty sharp, and I don't know if I'm getting into their market share or not. There's probably plenty of smart people on YouTube now these days that you don't need to listen to me necessarily, but hopefully, maybe, just maybe, I'll have something interesting to say. So I thought, I'm going to discuss several different topics. I'll talk about anything really, but today, maybe I'll start with the one thing that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, is psychology. And I just want to tell you about how psychology is completely flawed in so many ways. Now, I don't want to be overly critical of psychology. I certainly believe that there are things that you learn from psychology, from that study, that can be valid. But man, the flaws are major flaws. And I figured let's start with one today. Well, I guess maybe I can go more, but let's try to keep these videos on narrow. I guess I'll try my best to do that. I don't know if I always will, but categories. I find that psychology is a lot about categories. In fact, it's almost one of the major parts, and I'm really speaking of clinical psychology more than the other realms of psychology. Clinical psychology I find to be particularly flawed. Let's start with just the idea of clinical psychology. The idea itself sounds to me absurd, because the idea of clinical psychology is unlike other areas of psychology. It participates in should and should not. And whether or not someone should do something or should not do something, or whether someone should think about something or not think about something, or the actions that a psychologist should take or should not take. This is not science. This is not science. And I'd love for someone to maybe demonstrate the point. I'd love to hear someone say that, oh no, and in fact it is science, and I can demonstrate it. I'd be very interested in hearing that. Because it violates the Isolde distinction. That'd be the claim I'm making. My understanding is that the Isolde distinction comes from David Hume, and I have read some David Hume. I think David Hume is extremely important to remember, and in fact, most of you may not even know who David Hume is. Probably the majority don't, and that right there is the problem, I think. David Hume, especially when you think about science, you have to think about David Hume. David Hume was a great philosopher, philosophy. Anyway, the Isolde distinction says that you cannot put a premise forth that is an is and then from that premise conclude an ought, right? But that's exactly what science, what clinical psychology is all about. In clinical psychology, you start with an is, and the is apparently science, right? Science does something to, maybe scientific experiment, I guess, is the idea. And this experiment is supposed to reveal some truth about the way the world is. And then from there, we're supposed to conclude that one ought to do this or to do that. And as far as I can tell, science cannot at all tell me what one ought to do. There's no experiment in the universe. If someone can explain, if someone can find an experiment like this, I'd be very fascinated to hear about it. But there's not a single experiment in the universe that can tell me what I ought to do. Right? That's not science. I believe that that is a philosophy. I think that's philosophy, right? It's not science. And so that's my complaint. I think that psychology is massively flawed because these psychologists go in there presuming to know how one ought to behave. But there's not a single experiment in the universe that can tell you that. And if they're telling you how you ought to behave, and they're participating in in philosophy. If a psychologist is telling you how you ought to behave, they're participating in philosophy. And the problem I have with that is these psychologists are not philosophers, right? I mean, if you want to know what one ought to do, you should go to see a philosopher to talk about that, not a psychologist. And a psychologist might study philosophy. That's wonderful. That's great for him, if he does, or if she does. But that's not psychology in and of itself, though, right? So you're not really seeing the psychologist to see its psychologist. You're seeing a psychologist speak to a philosopher, if that psychologist is one who studies philosophy. But if they're studying psychology, then they have no clue what is or what ought to be. They can only tell you what is, according to their view. They claim to be scientists, and if that's their claim to be scientists, well, science can only tell you what is, not what ought. So